Hey everyone, this is Ryan Robinson here. If you haven't seen me on before, I'm one of the guys who does a lot of the work behind the scenes with the podcast, and just wanted to jump on before some of these podcasts coming up to ask if you would be willing to give us some feedback about what is and what is not working with the podcast so far. So we've set up a survey on the website, and if you have a couple minutes before or after this podcast, just jump over to mennonerds.com/podcasts/survey, and you'll be able to fill it out there, and that'll help us figure out what we can keep doing from here on. Thank you.
Hello, Mennonerds. My name is Caitlin Hansen, speaking to you from Church for All People in Columbus, Ohio. Welcome and glad to have you for another Mennonerds interview. I am here today with Dr. Ben Goossen. He is a global historian of religion and science. He's the author of Chosen Nation, Mennonites and Germany in a Global Era. And his book examines the relationships between Mennonites and German nationalism during the 19th and 20th centuries. And I'm going to read you a little bit more from his bio, where he talks about the book that engages questions of warfare and pacifism, theology and political activism, gender, genocide, and anti-Semitism to explore new methods of narrating the process of nationalization and global diaspora. His current project, The Year of the Earth, 1957 to 1958, Cold War Science and Making of Planetary Consciousness, is an interpretive history of the International Geophysical Year. Drawing on research conducted in 6 continents, it illuminates the intersections of science and geopolitics, including Antarctic law, the rise of big data, plate tectonic theory, and discovery of global warming at the dawn of the space age. I'd love to talk more about that if we get the chance as well. I know we're here to talk about Chosen Nation, but as someone that did a lot of research in big data, maybe we've got time, we'll touch on that as well. But to finish up with your bio, you're in the Department of History at Harvard University and have held the fellowships from the Fulbright Commission and German Academic Exchange Service, and received awards for excellence in teaching and scholarship from the Kansas Historical Foundation, Associated Church Press, the Canadian Church Press, Swarthmore College, and Harvard University. Ben edits the German Mennonite Source Database and is co-founder of Anabaptist Historians. His essays and reviews appear in publications ranging from Nova Religio and Waging Nonviolence to the Journal of History of Ideas blog. So that all sounds pretty exciting. I'm glad to be in conversation with you today. I think there's a lot of different directions that our conversation could take us. And so welcome, Ben. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Caitlin. It's wonderful to be here.
Sure. Maybe we could just start out if you'd tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what's formed your research interests to this point.
Absolutely. I'm of Mennonite background. I'm practicing Mennonite, and I'm a historian. And so the research that I've done for Chosen Nation and for some of my other work draws both on my kind of religious background and my particular upbringing in central and eastern Kansas in a Mennonite community. And it also, of course, comes from my interest in history and from some of the disciplinary conventions that historians often employ. So I'm originally from a Mennonite community, as I mentioned, in Kansas, where I learned that I was sort of from a Russian Mennonite background. We were the sort of Mennonites that often ate Zwieback and Varenica, and talked about the old country. And that was a kind of a history that I was interested in learning more about. And so lots of people delve into their past in different ways. And the discipline of history was one of the ways that I chose to learn a little bit more about my own past. And one of the major outcomes of that search, which took me to a lot of different places over many years, was the publication of my book, Chosen Nation.
Yeah, and so let's talk a little bit more about that. Where you went with the book, maybe some kind of summarize for us some of the overall themes and topics that you cover.
Chosen Nation is what I would call a book of global history. It looks at the relationship between ideas and peoples and countries across relatively large geographic expanses, and also across a pretty big slice of time. So thematically, about Mennonites and what I call German nationalism, which has a lot of different valences, anything from political citizenship to racial ideology, from about the beginning of the 19th century, the time when Napoleon was out conquering in Europe, to the present day. So there's about a 200-year time period that the book spans. And essentially, the main question that it asks is, what is the relationship between Mennonites as a group of people, as a denomination, as a church, with the sort of emergence of German nationalism in Europe and around the world across the 19th and 20th centuries.
And so what got you interested in researching that? I mean, what was your motivation as you started out?
Yeah, so as I mentioned a little earlier, the motivation largely came out of my own background growing up in Kansas. And I actually started the book with an anecdote about my own grandfather, who was at the time that I knew him, he was a retired Mennonite minister. His name was Henry Goossen, and had served in a lot of congregations, particularly in the central Kansas area. And I knew him as a really thoughtful person, someone who was very invested in what I tend to think of as the kind of traditional Mennonite or Anabaptist value of pacifism, of non-resistance. He was someone who preached that his whole life, also someone who really emphasized humility. But he was also someone who identified relatively strongly with certain forms of German nationalism, which I always found very sort of strange and incongruous. He identified as being what he called a proud Prussian, and talked often about our family's history in Germany in the 19th century. And I thought that was a little bit ironic, in large part because often today, sort of in general popular culture, we associate Prussia with militarism and nationalism, which sort of in relationship to my grandfather's pacifist sensibilities seem to be very incongruous. So I wanted to sort of understand, how was it that Mennonites like my grandfather in places like central Kansas and other places around the world could at the same time hold a kind of pacifist Anabaptist sensibility, but also a kind of German national sensibility. And as I began studying Central European history and the history of nationalism, some of the ways in which scholars and historians have talked about nationalism over the last particularly 20 or 30 years began to give me a sense of what it might look like to investigate the particular story of Mennonites' relationship to nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Yeah, and so how did you find that that is being nuanced? How are folks reconciling those concepts in their heads? Are they just holding on to cognitive dissonance without examining it too closely, or what did you find?
Well, the answer is, I think, all of the above. If you were to poll Mennonites from different communities all over the world in different years, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, or today, I think you would find people who have really different responses to that particular question. And that was one of the things that seemed so fascinating to me, because both of the sort of two different sides of this story, the kind of Anabaptist side and the German side, on these two different hands, often speak about populations as though they're kind of coherent and as though everybody more or less conforms to sort of the central tenets of the theology, if it's a church, or of the ideology, if it's a kind of nationalism. But that doesn't really describe exactly how populations actually interact with these ideas. Often their ideas are very sort of fluid and they change from place to place and so forth. And so one of the things that I was interested in was if people don't really conform to expectations of nationalists or expectations of maybe theologians, why is it that these narratives kind of develop in the first place? Why is it that a lot of people, for example, think that Mennonitism or Anabaptism is a historically and so one of the things I looked at was, where do these ideas come from? And so the first part of the book looks at the emergence of the idea that Mennonites are historically or ethnically German. And a lot of people, including myself when I was younger, I think would sort of imagine that Mennonites of European background in general are kind of Germanic, or maybe have roots in the Netherlands or in Switzerland or something like that. That's a common narrative that you would hear in places like Pennsylvania or Manitoba or Kansas, where I'm from. But as it turns out, and as I try to show in the book, at the beginning of the 19th century, in around 1800, you would have been very hard pressed to find Mennonites anywhere in the world who thought that they were German. That was simply not a very common idea. There was no German nation state, there was no country called Germany, and certainly there wasn't a very robust ideology that Mennonites or others could really plug into to say, we are German. And so it was a kind of slow and haphazard process across the 19th century, where particularly a group of Mennonite intellectuals in Germany were starting to make the case, kind of against all probability, that Mennonites as a denomination were historically, fundamentally German.
Yeah, and as part of your research for this book, you traveled through 3 different continents, exploring these ideas. How did that inform your research and ultimately what you had to say in your book?
It was terribly fascinating to talk with Mennonites in these different countries and continents. I did a lot of my research in North America. I did a lot of it in Europe, and a lot of it also here in South America. I'm currently in Buenos Aires. And it was terrifically interesting to talk to folks in all of these different places, many of whom had sort of similar stories about immigration out of Europe, to places like Kansas or to Paraguay or to Argentina or to Canada or to various different places, but also to think a little bit about how those stories diverged, how the specific context of where these folks ended up in different parts of Europe or in the Americas changed how they talked about their relationship to either their faith or to their ethnicity. And of course, I did a lot of research in different kinds of archives, church archives, university archives, government archives. I was interested in finding out as many different documents that told different pieces of the story that I was interested in researching from as many perspectives as possible. So I was looking, of course, for documents that were written by Mennonites. For example, in 1900, were there Mennonites who were saying, we are German or we are not German? That was a question I was really interested in. But I was also interested in documents that were produced by non-Mennonites, particularly by scholars who were writing about Mennonites, or by governments who were interested in understanding their Mennonite citizens, or maybe bringing Mennonite citizens to their country, or maybe pushing Mennonite citizens out of their country, and thinking about how other people categorized Mennonites in different times and places.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's all facets of the Mennonite diaspora, I suppose. And so you title your book Chosen Nation. Where does that title come from? What does that signify to you?
The title has 2 meanings. On one hand, there's the way in which quite a number of Mennonites would have used it historically, which is to speak about themselves as a kind of community, a nation that is chosen by God to serve particular purposes. It's, of course, a reference to the chosen nation or the chosen people of Israel, the Jewish people in the Old Testament. Many Mennonites in the 19th and 20th century would have read passages from the Old Testament to think about or basically as a kind of analogy for thinking about their own relationship to God as sort of a chosen people that had a particular set of sensibilities and a particular identity that differentiated them from others, and that also gave them a particular fate and destiny. The second idea, the second meaning of the title Chosen Nation has to do with nationality, where in the 19th century, this was a period in which nations were being formed. One of the sort of major developments in the modern period that historians have been writing about for quite some time is the emergence of nation states. The world today is divided into nation states like France or Germany or Poland or Canada. And we take those nation states to be more or less self-evident, but that's actually a relatively new phenomenon. And at the period where Mennonites were becoming nationalized in the 19th and early 20th century, that's the same period where all of these nation states were being formed for the first time. And so as they were being formed, Mennonite populations in different parts of the world were basically finding themselves forced to decide how they wanted to relate to these new states that were being formed. For just to give one example, Germany, a country that we sort of all know about now, was formed for the first time in 1871. And so when that happened, Mennonites who lived in Germany or who lived in neighboring countries had to decide, how do we want to relate to Germany? Do we want to be citizens? Or do we want to leave and go somewhere else? There were a variety of different options. And so there was a process that Mennonites went through for quite a number of years, in which they were quite literally choosing the nation that they wanted to belong to. And so that's what the sort of second meaning of the title refers to. Did they want to be German, or did they want to choose to be a part of a different nation, a Canadian nation, for example, a Mennonite nation, a Paraguayan nation, a French nation, etc.?
And so how was that process informed? Certainly, there's so much identity in, being set aside, not of the world. What process were folks going through as they made that choice, and how does that inform, identity for Mennonites today?
One of the main ways in which folks were confronted with these questions about which nation or which nationality to identify with was the question of privilege and of rights and responsibilities. So as these new states were forming, often they sought to create special rights and duties for people who lived within their borders that would be different, of course, than people who weren't citizens in those states. And so essentially the question was, for anyone who lived in sort of a newly formed nation state, was, do we want to kind of assimilate and reap the benefits that comes with citizenship and sort of full social equality? And so at the time when Germany formed in the 1870s, a lot of Mennonites who were living in Germany were sort of going back and forth on this question, because on one hand, assimilating into the nation state would have meant doing things like giving up pacifism and performing military service, which of course was a very difficult thing for ideological or theological pacifists, which many of these Mennonites were. But on the other hand, if they were willing to assimilate and, for example, give up pacifism and serve in the military, that would have afforded them essentially full citizenship rights, which would have come with more generous land holding and inheritance policies, as well as general legal rights and the ability to advocate for themselves in courts and with representatives of the bureaucracy and the political administration of the state and so forth. So there were real advantages in choosing to affiliate with Germany or with other states in which Mennonites might have lived, rather than retaining their kind of older sort of separatist identity. And so often they were attempting to decide whether they wanted to assimilate or not based on what the benefits, the sort of real social, political, and economic benefits would have been for them. And some Mennonites made the choice one way and some made it the other way. So my own family, for example, lived in Germany when it was formed in the 1870s, but they were relatively theologically conservative at the time. They were staunch pacifists. And so when military conscription was instituted in the North German Confederation, in the late 1860s, folks like the members of my family who lived particularly in the northeastern part of what became Germany in what was called East and West Prussia, those individuals advocated very strongly for the maintenance of exemption from military service. They didn't want to fight in the military. And that was a kind of a legal and political battle that went on for more than half a decade. But ultimately, Mennonites were unsuccessful in retaining their military exemption, which they had previously had in the areas in which they lived. And so because of that, a large number of Mennonites, including my own ancestors, left and came to the United States. But at the same time, many of their co-religionists, these other Mennonites who lived in Germany, were not interested in moving abroad for the sake of this principle, and many of them stayed behind and ultimately abandoned pacifism.
Yeah, interesting. And so conversely, or maybe, in reaction to some of those decisions, how does the new emerging nation of Germany react to this group of people that, potentially seen as quite problematic?
I feel like European states have sort of historically had kind of a love-hate relationship with Mennonites. On one hand, Mennonites have often lived in relatively self-contained communities that were often pretty innovative economically, agriculturally, and were often seen as sort of valuable residents of these different states in which they lived. And so that's one reason why in the Russian Empire, Mennonites, like other colonists from Central Europe, were kind of invited to come in the late 18th and early 19th century and settle newly conquered lands because they were seen as sort of valuable agricultural colonists. But at the same time, they had this kind of sort of anti-statist MO, where they were not particularly interested in going along with major state projects like conscription. And so there was this constant pressure that was being meted out by different states all across Europe against Mennonite populations in lots of different countries to try to get them to be more assimilated, to remain good colonists and to remain good agriculturalists and good inventors and that sort of thing. Sort of any economic skills that these Mennonites had were always interesting to state governments, but these state governments always also wanted Mennonites to be a little bit more ruly in their relationship to state dictates. And so that meant that because of this sort of constant state and social pressure that these Mennonites were feeling, there was always sort of a pressure to kind of modernize and assimilate and to become more in line with the sort of the dictates of state governments, and also with increasingly with national cultures. And so that's one of the main reasons why across Europe in different states, not at the same time, but over the course of about 100 years, started giving up their what today we might call sort of special theological principles, particularly their desire to swear oaths, but even more importantly than that, their opposition to military service. This began particularly in the South German states, the Northwest German states, and in the Netherlands. And by the end of the First World War, in 1917, 1918, into the early 1920s, a majority of Mennonites in Europe had abandoned pacifism and were performing military service.
Yeah, just interesting how those different historical pressures then inform, a whole new wave of theology. I'm also interested how, a lot of your work looking into, German history or not of, as we mentioned, the Mennonite diaspora, given this, your findings around nationality and ethnicity, what are the implications today for Mennonites of color that are experiencing this tension and these assumptions around what it means to be Mennonite?
I think that's a fabulous question, and it's one that I think goes back to the beginning of the 19th century, but also is incredibly relevant, one of the most relevant questions that there is for the global Mennonite church today. The sort of origins of global Anabaptism across the whole world, not just Europe and the Americas, goes back to the early 19th century when Mennonites in Europe started instituting foreign missions, particularly in India through Baptist representatives, and later in Dutch colonial Indonesia on the islands of Java and Sumatra. And since the mid-19th century, there have been Mennonites who wouldn't identify their own background as being Central European or European generally. And of course, that sort of wave of missions drastically increased in the 20th century, and particularly since the Second World War. And of course, since the 1990s, a majority of Mennonites worldwide today are folks of color. And even in places where a majority of Mennonites, sort of locally speaking, would still identify as kind of ethnically Mennonite or ethnically German, many of those folks in those congregations don't come from that particular ethnic Mennonite background. And so there's this sort of major demographic shift that's happened in the Mennonite church, basically in tandem the whole way through with the development of a kind of German nationalist or Mennonite nationalist, depending on who you're talking to, sensibility among many of the same communities that were doing this missionizing to non-white or to non-European populations in the first place. And so I think that that's ultimately a kind of fascinating tension, that the sort of the development of the global Anabaptist church developed at the exact same time as the idea that Anabaptists or Mennonites were fundamentally German. And so from my perspective, the idea of Mennonite ethnicity, or the sort of related idea that Anabaptists are historically or fundamentally German or European in some way, I think is a kind of a, maybe not necessarily consciously adopted or consciously realized, but I think more or less the way that it has functioned has been a way of kind of preserving a racial hierarchy within the church, at which ethnic Mennonites, that is Mennonites with a kind of self-identified European background, are often seen as more authentic than the Mennonites who might be more recent converts to Anabaptism, even when those Mennonites who are not ethnic Mennonites, Mennonites of color, let's say, or white Mennonites who don't have heritage, are much more numerous, globally speaking, than ethnic Mennonites.
And that's really fascinating, because all of that is developing, within and through Mennonite communities, even while, there's the rise of, what we know of German nationalism, German Nazism, and so for a group of people that might be apt to see themselves set apart, even while they're adopting, a new national identity. As you mentioned, they're wrestling with these ideas of hierarchies that we still bear the fruits of today, that legacy within the church. And so what was the reaction for these emerging groups as Nazism rose, as German identity was solidifying, and those are kind of two different phases or realms, but how did those ideas interact with each other?
I find the relationship between Mennonites and National Socialism and this history of Mennonites in the Third Reich and their perceptions of the Third Reich and the way that the Third Reich responded to them to be utterly fascinating. It's also something that I learned about entirely through doing this project. It's not something that I grew up hearing about. I don't think that it's a story that has been widely told, particularly in the United States, but also in other places around the world. And when I started this project, when I started doing the research that led to Chosen Nation, I knew virtually nothing about Mennonites' relationship to Nazism and the Third Reich. I guess I kind of assumed that Mennonites were, sort of as sort of a persecuted minority, as they had long been in Europe, probably didn't fare very well under the genocidal regime of Adolf Hitler. And it was in the course of researching Mennonites and nationalism during the 19th century that I started to wonder, precisely as you asked, what happened in the 20th century? What happened as German nationalism, which had many different strands, became increasingly racial and increasingly rabid and ultra-nationalist during the 1920s and then especially in the 1930s and 40s. And during that context, as Mennonites were becoming sort of increasingly entangled in German nationalism's many different variations, how did that really shake out in the Third Reich? What I learned was that my sort of supposition that Mennonites were probably uninterested in National Socialism and didn't fare well under it was actually not true. In fact, quite different from that. Mennonites in the Third Reich, by that time, had largely moved away from the sort of old idea of being a kind of separate people, and had been arguing at that point for at least 50 years. Sort of prominent church leaders, intellectuals, and scholars in the Mennonite community in Germany had been arguing for at least half a century that they were sort of fundamentally German, that, you know, some of these people even argued that Mennonites were more German than anybody else in Germany. Because if you think about it, Lutherans which is one of the major Protestant denominations in Germany, have many different nationalities that they're part of all over the world. The same thing can be said of Catholics. But these Mennonites were arguing that Mennonites were fundamentally German, and so in that sense they sort of claimed that they were the best Germans. One of the major planks of National Socialist ideology, of course, is that there is a racial hierarchy in which different peoples and populations can be ordered, with Germans, or Aryans as they called them, at the very top, and Jews at the bottom. And Mennonites, having identified themselves over the past half century or so as German, sort of fit naturally in the kind of Nazi imagination at the top of that racial hierarchy. And so far from being persecuted, for the most part, Mennonites in the Third Reich were often welcomed and praised by Nazi bureaucrats, functionaries, and scholars as being, to a certain degree, at the pinnacle of the sort of assumed racial pyramid.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, and as you mentioned, a little bit counterintuitive, or at least counter to hopes and what we might like for collective memory and self-identity. That's really interesting. And so then I would ask, how does a better understanding of that history inform identity and voice in today's world, as we're seeing in many ways a resurgence of some of these ideas and these identities? What does that say for Mennonites as we're watching the news?
Historians of Nazism do not like it when their work is relevant. I think that's a pretty generalizable statement. And when I began work on Chosen Nation, telling this story because it largely had not been told in English before. There was certainly German language work on Mennonites and Nazism, and as I did my research in Paraguay and Germany and elsewhere, I met with a lot of historians who had been learning about this work. But for me, this was sort of a process of uncovering a story that I thought was important for historical reasons. It was something that we should talk about because it happened in the past. But since the last couple of years, with Brexit, with the election of Donald Trump, with the rise of ultranationalist political parties, and also with the sort of resurgence, as you mentioned, of white nationalist and neo-Nazi groups in the United States, Europe, and other parts of the world, the sort of scholarship and sort of academic study of Nazism and fascism has taken on a kind of new life with real political significance in the present moment. And I find that personally to be sort of a frightening and also sort of an unfortunate turn of events. But I also think that it provides us an opportunity to look at the past, as you were suggesting, as a way of thinking about how we should deal with white nationalists, white supremacists, and neo-Nazis in the present moment. I think one of the main takeaways from the particular story of Mennonites and National Socialism, and of course the study of Nazism generally leads to a number of different ways of thinking about this, but if we look particularly at the Mennonite story, I think one of the lessons is that complacency in the sort of belief in the goodness of our own beliefs and our own faith and our own theology can be sometimes misguided and sometimes quite dangerous. I think that one of the misconceptions about Mennonites in Nazi Germany that a lot of people have had since the end of the Second World War is that there was a kind of abandonment of the Anabaptist vision, as Harold Bender famously called it, or of Mennonite principles in general, that allowed Mennonites in the Third Reich to collaborate with, or at least benefit from and think favorably about the Nazi regime. And my research suggests that that's actually not exactly the case. I think that probably most Mennonites, self-identified practicing Mennonites in the Third Reich, would have considered themselves to be good Christians, good people, and good Anabaptists. They didn't think that that pacifism was necessarily a part of Anabaptism. So in that sense, they had kind of abandoned a sort of a traditional tenet of Anabaptism, but they certainly considered themselves to be Christian, and they certainly considered themselves to be doing the right thing. And when the right thing is supporting Nazism, which of course looked very different across the period of the Nazi regime, but even in 1933, it was clearly very anti-Semitic, clearly very ultranationalist, and certainly by the Second World War, it was obvious that it was a genocidal, exclusionary, and deeply militarist regime. That was something that we today would, I think, in general, be extremely critical of for good reason. And so I think that if we're kind of going to, if there's a question about applying a lesson of what Mennonites in the Third Reich went through to today, I think it would be to simply not be complacent with ourselves and always think about how we might be engaging in systems that are larger than ourselves, that might be exclusionary, or that might prop up systems of injustice and inequality. Even if we don't support those systems explicitly, we often are part of them. For example, Mennonites today who identify as being ethnically Mennonite, I think probably would not necessarily read that way to a majority of other observers in, let's say, North America. They would probably read as being part of a dominant white culture. And so at the same time that Mennonites today in North America who identify as being ethnically Mennonite are often using that as a way of maybe without intending to, but I think functionally what's happening is that the sort of invocation of Mennonite ethnicity as a way of kind of denying our the reality that we're actually a part of a kind of a dominant white culture, a culture that is shot through with ideas of white supremacy. And thinking a little bit more critically about the relationship between discourses of Mennonite ethnicity and the reality of racial inequality in the United States and elsewhere is one way in which I think this history could be instructive for Mennonites today.
Yeah, in many ways serves as a stark warning, how to combat. There are such rich principles of shalom, and Ashita Moore talks about shalom as the vision and the hope and the goal, not just peacekeeping, but peacemaking, and how are we peacemakers, and all these values around being set apart, and not necessarily identifying with dominant culture, and in the ways that that one might be assimilated or assumed to be part of dominant culture, to actually actively combat that idea. I'm reminded of Dr. Beverly Tatum at Spelman College talks about racism as a moving sidewalk, that even by standing still, we are moving in synchrony and in support of racism, and you actually need to reverse and walk against that flow to make any sort of meaningful difference. But there could be some that argue, hey, we are supposed to be set apart from the system, and so even that walking against would not actually be our role. Have you seen any of those debates either in history or in the current climate?
Yeah, I really like this idea of standing still as still being part of a kind of a moving sidewalk, and the sort of attendant notion, the kind of solution to that being that there has to be a sort of a perpetual set of activities. We need to be perpetually engaged in dismantling racism and injustice and inequality in all of its forms as a kind of set of active activities that can really never allow us to be complacent. And I think that this set of questions has a particular resonance in the Mennonite context, as you suggested, precisely because of this propensity by self-identified ethnic Mennonites to identify themselves as a separate people, a people that is apart from what they traditionally call the world, as a place that is where evil resides, and that there's a kind of pure community that we can inhabit that is not engaged with that. I think I personally find that to be relatively inaccurate way of thinking about how Mennonites, even Mennonites who live in enclosed communities and relatively self-contained or homogenous communities interact with the world around them. I personally tend to think, based on this work that I've done and on the work like the scholars that you mentioned, many others in the academy, activists, etc., that we're always engaged, whether through economic systems, the goods that we purchase, or through social systems, simply allowing the maintenance of sort of social systems around us to continue in or the sort of allowing these sort of unjust systems to continue. There are plenty of examples of that in Mennonite history, where groups that are often valorized by their descendants today, closed off and more or less unengaged or disengaged from larger populations around them, were actually deeply involved in, for example, the expropriation of native peoples and the construction of imperial states. So, for example, in his famous pamphlet from the 1940s, The Anabaptist Vision, Harold Bender argued that Mennonites, that their Anabaptism was very closely related to the sort of spirit of democracy. That was one of the claims that he made in that piece. But from a historical perspective, prior to that time, Mennonites were probably much more implicated in imperialism than they ever were in democracy, including across all of Old World Europe. And if you think about the Mennonite colonies, for example, in the Russian Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries, Mennonite colonies being formed in places like Brazil and Paraguay, and even in places like my home state of Kansas and in the western prairies of Canada, the act of sort of establishing these kind of what these Mennonites at the time might have considered pure homogeneous communities was often done in the wake of governments coming out and clearing in native peoples and making that land empty, as these Mennonites considered it, for settlement and colonization. And so the establishment of these kind of homogeneous communities, I think it's safe to say pretty much without exception, occurred in the direct context of the disadvantaging of other populations that had lived there previously.
You know, as you alluded to, it's amazing how relevant a lot of this historical research is in today's world, which is really rather unfortunate. I mean, every academician wants their research to be relevant, but maybe not quite so on the nose. And so with that in mind, who do you feel is your audience as you've written Chosen Nation? Is it the academy? Is it the local church, local Mennonite communities? Is it non-Anabaptist communities that are trying to understand kind of historic and current motivations? Who do you view as being the audience for your book?
As you alluded, what academics want and what academics get are not always the same things. I think ideally this is a book that would speak to lots of different audiences, and I'll be very curious to see now that it's been published how that ultimately plays out. I am certainly hoping to talk to Mennonite populations. I think that this book has a lot to say to the Mennonite Church today. I, as a practicing Mennonite, someone who is very involved in the Mennonite community in North America, but also I've really enjoyed getting to know Mennonites and other Anabaptists through my travels and other places around the world, and I'm certainly invested in the state of the church and the church's relationship to other communities in North America and elsewhere around the world. And one of the most rewarding parts of researching and talking about Chosen Nation thus far has been the opportunity to talk to Mennonites at conferences and in different congregations. It's been really fascinating to see how Mennonites with different relationships to this historical story of Mennonites and German nationalism have responded to the work that I've been doing. In some places, the people that I talk to at churches or in households or wherever are direct descendants of the actors in my book, grandchildren or great-grandchildren or something like that, who have inherited a lot of the stories that I tell in Chosen Nation in their own families, and then see them reflected maybe a little bit differently in the way that I've chosen to tell the story. In some other cases, there are Mennonites who have no knowledge virtually of the history of Mennonites and German nationalism or of certain parts of the story, and are simply really interested in learning about what happened in Prussia in the 1870s or what happened in occupied Ukraine under Nazi occupation during the Second World War. So that's been a real joy and pleasure, and particularly to hear how Mennonites connect some of these stories from the past to issues that are real and live in their congregations today, surrounding issues of sexuality or nationality or race in the present moment. But of course, I'm also interested in talking to non-Mennonites, to the wider academy, and also to general readers. One of the main arguments that I make in Chosen Nation is an argument that speaks to debates that historians of nationalism have been having for the last 20 years or more, where they're interested in thinking about how to talk about the formation of nation states and the emergence of nationalism over the past 200 years in a world where nation states continue to be very powerful and important, but at the same time don't necessarily, sort of ideologies of nationalism don't necessarily predict how people on the ground identify or don't identify with a given nation state. So one example is this case with Mennonites, where well into the 19th century, at the same time that the German nation state was forming, many Mennonites, both in Germany and around the world, didn't really think of themselves as German. So why was that, and how do we talk about that? And I think that one of the ways in which I'm trying to contribute to this debate is by talking about the relationship between religion and nationalism in a way that hasn't quite been put together in this particular way before. One of the arguments that I make in Chosen Nation is that categories that we might often think of as separate, religion, are often quite fluid and interchangeable. And what might look like a religion at one moment can very much look like a nationality at another moment. That might be the case over years or decades, or it might be different from one country to another, or it might be even the case in a single lifetime. with a given individual. So just to give you one example of that, during the First World War, in many countries around the world, it wasn't particularly advantageous to be seen as German in the United States, in Canada, or in all countries that were at war with Germany during the First World War. Mennonites often chose not to identify as German because Germany was the enemy, and so they would instead identify as Dutch or as Mennonites or as something else. But then during the Second World War, many Mennonites, for example, in the Soviet Union, these were folks who maybe had identified as Dutch during the First World War to avoid being discriminated against as German, once again chose to identify as German once they came under German occupation as the Nazi army and Nazi military units invaded eastward. And so there was a kind of flipping, a changing of identity based on who was in control at that time. And then one final example with some of these same individuals who had identified first as maybe German or first as maybe Dutch and then as German during the Second World War. After the Second World War, with the fall of Hitler and the fall of the Third Reich, it was no longer particularly advantageous to be seen as German once again. And so many of these individuals sought to leave Europe as immigrants, as refugees, and come to places like Canada or to the United States or to Paraguay or to Uruguay or some other place. But at that time, anyone who identified as German was ineligible for certain forms of refugee assistance from the United Nations, which had recently been formed. And so a lot of these individuals, because they had this long history of flipping from one national identity to another, German in any meaningful sense, but they were actually nationally or racially or ethnically Mennonite. That was the term that they used. And they claimed that they had this kind of Mennonite ethnicity that was totally distinct from German ethnicity. And so in this sense, they used their kind of religious identity for purposes of creating a new national category that allowed them to gain particular material benefits, in this case, refugee assistance from the United Nations to leave war-torn Europe in the late 1940s and early 1950s and come to a new, better home in North or South America.
That's fascinating. Kind of feels a little bit like playing both sides, that, you know, identifying with a nation as when it's convenient, and taking that sort of separatist, set-aside view at other times. Yikes. And so, as folks, read your book, interact with it, and process it, what are some of the main takeaways that you hope your audience will walk away with as they're digesting what you've written?
I think that one of the main things I'd like readers to think about, or people who hear this podcast, or otherwise engage with this history, is simply to think about the degree to which stories we tell ourselves about our past are often quite recently constructed, often for political purposes or social purposes that we ourselves might not identify with or want to be identified with today. And so when we choose to identify with a nation or with a religion or with a set of beliefs of any sort, I think it's worth very critically thinking about what those beliefs mean, why they were developed, who developed them, and for what purposes, and what it means for us to choose to hold on to those and to advocate for those in our own lifetime. This sort of process of critical inquiry and engagement is a little bit like this idea of not standing still that you brought up earlier. It's something that we can never really be complacent with because, of course, political dynamics are changing all the time. And so there's a kind of constant ongoing process of engagement with both questions of nationality and also questions of religion that I'd like people to be involved with. I think the second idea is one that we touched on earlier as well, simply that that even if we don't want to identify with larger unjust systems, things like capitalism or American militarism, for example, often we can be implicated in those simply by existing within a particular society and engaging in systems of political networks that we're already embedded in. And so identifying these systems of injustice and trying to work against them is something that I think is a process that could be common to Mennonites from 200 years ago, 100 years ago, and also today. And it's something that I think reading history often makes us aware of. And of course, finally, there's the specific story of Mennonites' involvement with Nazism and Mennonites' involvement with the Holocaust of European Jews that is an ongoing question that is very specific to the Mennonite Church. That's something that has gained a lot of publicity and traction as an issue for public debate in Europe and in the Americas, really in the last 3 or 4 years. It's sort of an ongoing conversation that I think members of the Mennonite Church across the whole world can and should be plugged into. There's a sort of ongoing series of conferences, papers, blogs, discussions, and dialogues being sponsored by church organizations, by scholars, and by individual communities, thinking about, if this is really part of our past, if there were a very substantial number of Mennonites who in the 1930s and 40s were directly involved in National Socialism, and by extension, the Holocaust. What responsibility do we, as a group of believers, have to this particular past? And I think that's an open question that is one that really is specifically for the Mennonite Church, and I really look forward to seeing where the church goes with that in the coming years.
Yeah, those are all really important concepts for us to continue to be wrestling with on an ongoing basis. And so appreciate your contribution in challenging us to do so. We're coming close to the close of our time. And so I can't help myself. First of all, just want to ask what's next for you in general. And then for me as a person with a background in biology and high throughput data, I'm just fascinated by what research you're doing with big data and global warming. That's right up my alley. And what the heck does it have to do with the research you've done to this point?
That's a great question. I am currently researching a book project on the history of an event in the 1950s that listeners to this podcast likely will not have heard of. It's called the International Geophysical Year, and it's a misnomer in several ways. For example, even though it says it was the International Geophysical Year, it was actually an 18-month event that happened from mid-1957 until mid-1958. And essentially, it was a massive collaborative project between 67 different countries in the late 1950s to study planet Earth. Governments and scientists were extremely interested in knowing what the Earth was and how it worked. There were a lot of basic questions that we take for granted, the answers to which we take for granted today, that simply weren't known in the mid-1950s. So a lot of the things that kids might learn in elementary school today were kind of discovered or confirmed as part of this International Geophysical Year in the 1950s. For example, the fact that the Earth exists with a series of moving tectonic plates that form continents, and the fact that there is global warming that's caused by humans. These are some of the discoveries that were made during the International Geophysical Year. And so I'm currently on an 18-month research trip to look at archives all over the world, where scientists were studying what they call geophysics. And that would have been everything from glaciology, meteorology, the study of volcanoes and radiation, geomagnetism, and different forms of astronomy. There were many different disciplines that were basically being studied by these scientists in the 1950s. And then, because there was so much data being gathered in all of these different countries and all different parts of the world, one of the major things that these scientists had to do was put together their data in what they called world data centers. And this was really before the high age of computers. Technology that they came up with was more or less microfilm or microcards, where data that was being produced, or let's say glaciology, could be reduced in size to really small cards that could then be mailed through airmail, basically, to a series of holding centers in different places around the world. There was one in the United States, one in the Soviet Union, and then a third one that was kind of dispersed by discipline to different countries. And in some ways, that's the origins of big data as we think about it today. You know, people reducing data to these little cards and mailing it off to the nearest data center, where it could then be accessed by different scientists around the world. One of the most famous pieces of the International Geophysical Year that folks will have heard of is Sputnik. And the origins of the space race. The launching of satellites by both the Soviet Union and the United States was a major piece of studying the Earth and the relationship to the environment around it. So essentially, I'm interested in global history and how we think about the globe and how we think about relationships between people on one part of the Earth to people on different parts of the Earth. And this is a topic that seems very far from the history of Mennonites and Mennonite research, but the ideas about nationality and diaspora and science and scholarship and their connections across these kind of dispersed networks over time and space is at least something that I would see as sort of a major connection between my first project, Chosen Nation, and the current work that I'm doing now.
Well, that's fantastic, and I'm very interested in how we wrestle with big data and how we're handling it, and frankly have concerns going forward with all of that. And so, you know, as you continue in that work and get ready to make your findings public, we'll absolutely have to get together again and host another Mennonites interview together on those topics. And so maybe as we head out, why don't you tell our audience where they can find you, find more information, and where they can find your book.
Great. Well, it's been just a real pleasure to talk with you. Thanks so much for taking the time and for conducting the interview and for all the work that you do with Mennonites. I am on Twitter, and so you can certainly find me at Ben Goossen, BenGoossen. I also have links to my book and to other articles that I've written. Articles are available to download for free. They're both in German and in English. And if you just do a Google search for Ben Goossen, Harvard University, the first link at the top of your page, you can order the book or read any of the articles for free there. And certainly feel free to reach out to me at my email address, which is linked there in the contact info, if you want to know any more about Mennonites and German nationalism or about big data and the International Geophysical Year. So thank you so much.
That's great, Ben. This has been a Mennonites interview with Ben Goossen out of Harvard University. My name is Caitlin Hansen with Church for All People in Columbus, Ohio. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, this is Paul Walker. If you like what you just heard, be sure to check out more of what we have to offer at mennonerds.com. It's the hub for all things Mennonerds. From there, you can learn more about these podcasts, syndicated blogs from people all over the world, books authored by some of our members, and a host of other exciting free resources for you and your church. Now, there's one last thing. What we do costs a bit of money, and we're always doing it on a volunteer basis. We have people that are committed to making this happen, but we could use more people. If you like what we do, please consider donating monthly. We have two options. You can either do a monthly donation through Patreon, or you can give a one-time donation at any time through PayPal. We love the work we do, but we do need your help to keep it going and to expand into new territory. If you would like to donate, check out mennonerds.com/donate. Thanks for listening, And as always, have a great day.